concluded. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Prime Minister. Can he confirm that the Ensuring Integrity Bill would mean the same actions taken by unions for asbestos victims could result in union officials being struck off, unions being deregistered and rogue employers like James Hardie getting off scot-free? Can the Prime Minister tell the asbestos victims who are in the gallery right now why he is on the side of rogue employers like James Hardie rather than the victims in the gallery today?
The Attorney-General. Members on my left. The Attorney-General, the Leader of the House, has a call.
Well, Mr Speaker, it is simply an incorrect contention. It's simply an incorrect contention. It's one that has been made before. In fact, I think during the Senate committee process on this bill, the point was sought to be made. It's not a true point, but the point was sought to be made that minor infractions of industrial law could lead to deregistration. That's absolutely not the case. And in fact, Mr Speaker, when it was raised during the Senate committee process by members opposite and endorsed by them, they took issue with two sections of the law, sections 28F and 28G in the bill. And what is most notable, I think, about those two sections is those two sections in the current bill were put into the industrial law by Labor in 2009. They were put into the industrial law by your side of politics in 2009.
Members on my left.
The government has absolutely no interest, and it is a ridiculous proposition to suggest that anything other than the most serious, repetitive law-breaking would ever result in deregistration, and that is for a great number of reasons, including the fact that ultimately the question resides with a court as to whether or not it would be just in all the circumstances to re-register. And the fact is that we have organisations at the moment, such as the CFMEU, who are in such constant and repetitive breach of the laws of this country that nothing is able to be done about them.
Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, on direct relevance, when we have asbestos victims in the gallery, you can at least give them 3 minutes. At least 3 minutes to talk about a real issue.
Resume his seat. The Attorney-General and Leader of the House has the call, and he is being relevant to the question.
Yes, the answer to the question is direct. This is not about those victims. Not about them at all. Who it is about is the 83 separate CFMMEU officials who, since January 1, 2017, have breached the industrial law of Australia.
The Leader of the House will just pause for a second. The member for Griffith interjects loudly every day. The next interjection will see her ejected. Okay? And if you have, I've made that very, very clear. Leader of the House.
It's not about the people that you cite. This is about the 83 separate CFMMEU officials who, since 1 January 2017, have breached the law of this country 426 times, and you turn a blind eye to it, and you will not support the legislation that would let a rational, reasonable government end that sort of behaviour. That's the sort of behaviour we're talking about, not the spurious and pathetic argument that you're raising here now.
The member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is providing stability and certainty in response to the major challenges Australia is facing both at home and abroad? Is the Prime Minister aware of alternative approaches?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Lindsay for her question, because all those on this side of the House, when we went to the last election, we went to the election with a plan to ensure that we could further strengthen our economy and we could operate with a very disciplined and strong budget, and we could provide the stability and certainty that Australians were seeking at that election. And that is what we have been doing from the day we were elected, and that is what we've been delivering, Mr Speaker, in accordance with the plans we set out at that election. Now, importantly, without a strong economy, without focusing on ensuring our economy can move ahead, then that is at the centre of everything. And that's why we have already acted as part of our plan to ensure that Australians could keep more of what they earn by lowering taxes. And earning more. We are acting to reduce the costs of actually operating in this economy, whether it's on the review being done in terms of the regulations that can slow employment in the industrial relations area, or on top of that the stultifying regulations, the bureaucracy that can impede investments, whether it's housing developments, Mr Speaker, or whether it's environmental regulations that are unnecessary to ensure that we can move through and get these projects happening, where there are dams like the Dungowan Dam, Mr Speaker, and I commend the New South Wales State Government for the decision they took last night in Cabinet to ensure that those dam projects can proceed, reducing the costs of doing business. Thirdly, to ensure that we can give our young people, those right across the age spectrum in our labour force, the skills they need and the business skills that they need to be successful, and to ensure that those businesses who are going to employ them are getting the skilled workforce that they need. We need to fix our skills system. It is an urgent need of repair, and I thank the state and territory premiers for their engagement on this issue, and I look forward to working closely with them as we continue to fix the problems in our skills sector. To build the $100 billion of transport infrastructure to enable our economy to grow, to connect our markets with our farmers, to connect our businesses to their customers, to connect employees to their workplace so people can get home sooner and safer. And we can ensure that our cities operate in a more efficient way and lift productivity, and to expand our horizons, whether it's our trade barriers or we're realising the opportunities, whether it's in new sectors like the space industry, Mr Speaker, or it's in backing our traditional sectors in agriculture and forestry and fisheries and mining, Mr Speaker, which have always been such a central part. Now, this is in delivering a stronger budget for this nation, which means that we have the resilience to face future challenges, to respond to the drought as we're doing now, and the resilience to deal with the pressures on the budget, whether it's in aged care or disabilities, so we can guarantee the essentials that Australians rely on. Now, there is an alternative path, and it's offered by those opposite. Instead of stability and certainty, they want to blow the budget with their reckless spending.
The Prime Minister's
they want to blow
time
your
has
budget.
concluded. The member for Griffith.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why did the Prime Minister tell the people of New South Wales on Sunday the Commonwealth would fund 3 water infrastructure projects on a 50-50 basis, when half the Commonwealth contribution is in the form of loans, making the Commonwealth funding of the projects just 25%?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I'm glad the member opposite can read a press release, because we're very transparent about the arrangements that we put in place for these major projects, and we're getting on and doing those projects, and I absolutely welcome the support of the New South Wales Government. I mean, these projects are projects that frankly should be fully funded by state governments, Mr Speaker, but under our government we are going to turn up and support state governments that want to build dams. And our support to this project is in 50% of the funding. Half of that is coming concessional finance and half of that is coming in direct grant support. That's what we announced on Sunday, and that's what was warmly received by the New South Wales State Government. And whether it's the Shire Council up there in the member for New England's electorate or elsewhere across New South Wales, because we're getting on and we're building dams, Mr Speaker. We're building infrastructure. We have $1.5 billion now in 21 water infrastructure projects all around the country, whether it's Scottsdale down in Tasmania, Mr Speaker, or now out in Dungowan, or up in Queensland where we'd like to build a lot more dams. We want to build the Emu Swamp Dam, Mr Speaker, and I get the interjections from those opposite, so I encourage them to ring the Premier of Queensland, who is the only person standing in between the Emu Swamp Dam being built, Mr Speaker. and the Rickwood Weir being built to the full capacity that we pledged to build. We want to get on and build this dam infrastructure, this water infrastructure, the pipelines, the plumbing of the nation, which is going to support our agricultural industries, not just today but into the future. So, Mr Speaker, on this side of the House, we want to build dams. We want to build lots of dams. On that side of the House, they don't want to build any dams, Mr Speaker. And how do we know that? Because their Labor cousins in the states continue to say no each and every time.
The member for Mallee.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister please inform the House how the Morrison-McCormack government's record level of investment in rural and regional Australia is ensuring prosperity and resilience for these communities into the future?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Mallee for her question, Mr Speaker, and acknowledge that she is one of those fine women, and there are many in the House. Appreciate many on this side, and one or two on that side, indeed the crossbench, Mr Speaker, who are celebrating Rural International Women's Day. And it's an important day. It's an important day. It acknowledges exactly what our empowered rural women are achieving, what they are doing, and particularly in this time of drought, women who are the backbone of regional Australia and regional farmers, they are to the forefront, Mr Speaker. And I also acknowledge what the member for Mallee did before she came to this place, Mr Speaker, and if those opposite would just be quiet, they might actually learn something about the member for Mallee, who provided a safe place and a safe haven for women in her area, in the Sunraysia, to get a job. She took in women who were victims of domestic violence. She took in women who were Indigenous. She took in women who were down on their luck. She took in women who didn't have the skill set to get a job. And she took in some women who had just missed out on an opportunity, and she taught them great skills to be able to get them work, to be able to get them employment, to be able to achieve for them a better future. That's the member for Mallee, a powerful, strong-voiced woman who is achieving great things in the Mallee and going to achieve sensational things for rural and regional Victoria and indeed through that state, Australia, via this place. Mr Speaker, I acknowledge the role that women have played in rural and regional Australia. None more proud am I than of my two sisters, Denise Buchanan and Robin Brill, who are participating in family farms. They're doing it tough in and around Wagga Wagga District. In fact, they're doing it tough right throughout Australia, and we're there to support them all of the way. In the members' electorate, the Shire of Bullock did a two-day conference through the Building Better Regions Fund, empowering women to be their best selves. And I acknowledge the Shire and I acknowledge the member for Mallee for her continued work and support in this regard. Just recently I was in the member for Calaire's electorate, where Rosemary Blouse and her husband Phillip are doing some great work providing feed for sheep in an innovative way through sprouts. They're producing 6 tonnes of feed from 1 tonne of seed, and their fat lambs are then sent to the Breakout Butchery at Breakout Lamb Processing Centre at Cowra, and it's providing hope and resilience for those particular farmers in near Yeovil. They are great workers, they are great doers, and we should exalt regional Australia in these tough times, because regional Australia is doing very well despite the drought. We understand that, but there are some great and positive stories about rural and regional Australia, and we should promote those, we should exalt those, and we should acknowledge those.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is again to the Prime Minister, and I refer to his previous answer. Why won't the Prime Minister admit that the Commonwealth will fund just 25% of the cost of the dams, not the 50-50 investment that he claimed in this media release just 48 hours ago? Why can't the Prime Minister give a straight answer to a simple question?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I refer again to my answer. I was very clear. Our 50-50 funding—
Members on my left.
Our contribution is comprised half of grant, half of concessional finance. That is the commitment that we've made, and that we set out on Sunday when we were in Dungowan, Mr Speaker. And I refer the members opposite to the statements that have been made about this. We were very upfront about it, and I'm very pleased that the New South Wales Premier was so pleased to receive the support, because it was a month ago when we sat down, the Deputy Prime Minister and I, with the Deputy Premier and the Premier of New South Wales, to see how we could be fast-tracking important water infrastructure projects in New South Wales. And I was very pleased to get that collaboration and that cooperation and the urgency that the New South Wales Premier was going to bring to this task, not only to bring their resources to this project, but to bring their commitment to blast away the bureaucracy and the congestion of regulation that would prevent those projects from going ahead. So we're very happy to partner in the way we have, Mr Speaker. We took a $75 million commitment for just one of those projects to about $280 million in direct grant assistance, and that is a very significant increase on the commitment that we've made for important water infrastructure. And when I was with the Deputy Prime Minister and the member for New England, when we were up there on the weekend, to hear the local mayor talk about just how important for the Peel Valley region this was going to be to guarantee investment into the future and the future of that town, because drought or no drought, the investment in this water infrastructure is important for the future of rural and regional Australia. And as tough as our grazing and farming communities are doing it, and the towns that depend on their success, they are also raising with us constantly the issues of longer-term financial sustainability and viability of those towns into the future of rural and regional Australia. And that's why we've established and taken the initiative to set up the House inquiry into this very matter and hear about the exciting ideas that Australians have throughout rural and regional Australia to secure their future. Now, we're backing them in with better trade agreements, lower taxes, investing in important infrastructure, not just on water but on transport as well. And we'll continue to do it because on this side of the House we believe in the future of rural and regional Australia. Last night I was at the NFF dinner and I heard of issue after issue that our farmers have fought for over the last 40 years. On every single occasion we're on their side, Mr Speaker, and on so many other occasions those on the opposite side were battling against our farmers. Not on this side of the House, Mr Speaker. We are for rural and regional Australians.
The Leader of the Opposition seeking to table the document.
Yes, Mr Speaker. I'm seeking to table the Prime Minister's media release from just 48 hours ago, which speaks about 50-50 investment in a number of places and nowhere speaks about loans.
Leave granted. Leave is not granted. Just before I call the member for Clark, I'd like to inform the House we have present in the gallery this afternoon the winners of this year's My First Speech competition. On behalf of the House, I extend a very warm welcome to Lucy Longquist, Alexander Matters and Clara Kim, and congratulations again. The member for Clark.
Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. Minister, the government claims Australia will meet its Paris Agreement targets in a canter. However, the truth is that the government is relying on accounting tricks to meet our targets by counting artificially inflated credits left over from the Kyoto Protocol, credits which most developed countries have agreed to reject. Meanwhile, official government figures show that our emissions have reached record highs and continue to rise, fuelling the climate emergency, the effects of which we're already seeing in our backyard with the drought and fires. In other words, our planet is cooking while the government cooks the books. So, Minister, why the denial, and when will the government take real action to reduce emissions?
The Minister for Energy has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, I thank the member for his question. Well, whilst some in this place are keen on symbolism, we are keen on real and meaningful action. That's why we have strong targets as part of coordinated global action, and those targets involve a 26% emission reduction obligation, which will see a 50% reduction in our emissions per capita and a 65% reduction in our emissions intensity across the economy, across the whole economy, Mr Speaker.
Now, we have an enviable track record in meeting and beating our targets, an enviable track record. Indeed, we're on track to overachieve, meet and beat our 2020 targets by 367 million tonnes, and there's few countries that can boast such a report card, Mr Speaker, and we believe credit should be where credit is due, because Australian households and businesses have worked hard to overachieve, to meet and beat those targets. Now, Mr Speaker, that overachievement of 367 million tonnes is a 1.1 billion tonne turnaround on what we inherited from those opposite. We're also seeing record levels of investment in renewables, Mr Speaker. In fact, in the last year, calendar year 2018, the investment in Australia per capita was more than France, Germany and the UK combined, Mr Speaker, combined. We have a clear plan to meet our 2030 targets through our fully funded climate solutions package, $3.5 billion climate solutions package, which includes the $2 billion Climate Solutions Fund, energy efficiency initiatives, hydro projects, including Battery of the Nation and the Marinus Link in Tasmania. And looking forward, Mr Speaker, we're investing in technologies of the future, and that includes our national hydrogen strategy, where we've already invested $140 million, and that's contributed $50 million to the hydrogen energy supply project in the Latrobe Valley, a very important project for this crucial technology, and the Gemina power-to-gas trial in New South Wales, alongside a range of other hydrogen projects, Mr Speaker. All of this is focused on achieving our emission reduction obligations whilst we keep a strong economy, whilst we don't trash the economy, which is the policy those opposite took to the last election.
The member for Braddon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer outline to the House how the Morrison government is delivering on its plan for an even stronger economy by building resilience and rewarding aspiration? And is the Treasurer aware of any threats to our economy?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Braddon for his question. And he's been a successful small business person who has been involved in a concrete manufacturer and a number of agri-businesses, and he understands the importance of a strong economy. Now, let me remind the House, when the Coalition came to government, unemployment was rising, investment was falling, and we inherited $240 billion of accumulated deficits, which had reached 3% of GDP. Wind the clock forward to today, Mr Speaker, and we have delivered the first balanced budget in 11 years, Mr Speaker, the first balanced budget in 11 years. Full-time jobs growth is now the strongest in 12 years, Mr Speaker, and welfare dependency is at its lowest level in 30 years, Mr Speaker. And the Coalition has helped create 1.4 million new jobs, Mr Speaker, and open markets right around the world for Australian businesses to export into nearly 2 billion new customers, Mr Speaker. And now our economic plan, which involves more than $300 billion of legislated tax cuts, which involves $100 billion of an infrastructure pipeline, Mr Speaker, which involves creating 80,000 new apprenticeships, which involves cutting red tape, Mr Speaker, and which involves entering into new free trade agreements, is helping to create jobs. Because this is what the Coalition does. The Coalition pays back Labor's debt, Mr Speaker. The Coalition reduces taxes, Mr Speaker, and the Coalition creates millions of new jobs. But I'm asked about any alternative policies and any threats to this approach, Mr Speaker. Now we know the member for Rankin likes to tax a lot, Mr Speaker. In fact, the member for Rankin was knighted for his services to higher taxes, Mr Speaker, before the Speaker took away his knighthood, Mr Speaker. The reality is the member for Rankin was the co-architect of $387 billion with the now silent member for McMahon, who sits there wallowing in his silence, Mr Speaker, because he knows that the retirees tax, the housing tax, the higher income tax, the family taxes, and the family business taxes and the superannuation taxes were put together by him and the member for Rankin, Mr Speaker, and they are still on Labor's books. You can't trust Labor with the public's money. Only the coalition will create a stronger economy.
Just before I call the member for Rankin, I'd also like to inform the House that we have joining us in the gallery this afternoon the former member for Maranoa, former minister and former Deputy Speaker, the Honourable Bruce Scott. The member for Rankin.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why do the Prime Minister's talking points make absolutely no reference to the 1.9 million Australians who are looking for a job or for more work, the worst wages growth on record, weak household consumption and retail spending, and the worst household savings rate in a decade?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm very pleased the member made reference to the talking points, Mr Speaker. I suspect we might want to make it a habit of actually issuing these on a weekly basis, because it was the first time I'd seen our policies faithfully reported in some publications for some period of time. And what I notice about our talking points, which they refer to, is you'll find a lot of detail on the extensive policy work and implementation that our government is doing. And you can work through all of those documents, as I'd encourage those opposite to do, and they might learn one or two things about how you reduce taxes, Mr Speaker, because that seems to be anathema, because when you pick up the Labor Party's talking points, what you'll hear about is higher taxes, not lower taxes. And when you look at the second point, you can see there that we want to reduce the cost of doing business, whether it's on dealing with the clutter of environmental regulation, some of which is unnecessary, and the clutter of what is done around industrial legislation. But you won't find that in Labor's talking points. What you'll find is more legislation and regulation which will increase the cost of doing business and take away people's jobs, Mr Speaker. You won't find in there an acknowledgement of the need to actually deal with the skills challenges of this country in a serious way and acknowledge about how the system has been failing us right across the board and the need to properly reform that system, but you'll find it in ours. You won't find in there an enthusiasm for expanding the trade borders of our country. You won't find that in the Labor points, but you'll certainly find it in ours, and you'll also find the record of us achieving it, taking the amount of our trade covered by agreements from 26% to 70% under our watch, and we're heading to 90%, Mr Speaker. But what you will find is the dithering and the delay when it comes to the Labor Party, as they've fought against many of those agreements which we've been able to bring through this parliament and see them supported. And, Mr Speaker, you won't find in there their support for our traditional industries like mining and resources. You won't find that, Mr Speaker. Well, you might find it from the member for Hunter. You may well find that from the member for Hunter, and I'm a bit worried that the member for Hunter seems to be losing the argument when it comes for sensible policy, when it comes to emissions reduction. And I'd invite him to bring his posse over here because, Mr Speaker, he's losing the argument on that side, because on that side they're not for responsible emissions reduction targets, which is what we took to the election. They're for reckless targets that cost people's jobs. So what you'll find on their talking points are policies and ideas that will increase your taxes, blow the budget, cost you a job, ensure that they're pursuing an approach which has recklessness at its absolute core. I'm very happy with what's on our talking points because it sets out a big agenda that was endorsed by the Australian people, and we will continue to implement this agenda every single day.
Has concluded. The member for Ryan.
Thank you kindly, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Population, Cities and Urban Infrastructure. Will the minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is progressing congestion-busting infrastructure across Brisbane, including in my electorate of Ryan?
The Minister for Population, Urban
I thank the member for Ryan for his question. And Since Parliament last sat, the member for Ryan joined me to announce a terrific congestion-busting agreement with the Brisbane Lord Mayor Adrian Schrinner, and this agreement involved 9 congestion-busting projects in the Brisbane City Council area, with a total federal commitment of $115 million. Every single one of those projects we agreed would be underway in the next 12 to 24 months, with the first one starting the beginning of next year. Now, Mr Speaker, this is one of the larger of the 9 projects that we announced that day. The member for Ryan has been calling for literally years, even before he has become a member of parliament, and that is the notorious Indooroopilly roundabout. And as the member for Ryan knows, this roundabout is actually one of the busier ones in Brisbane, catering for over 100,000 cars that go through that roundabout every single day. Moreover, it's one of the more dangerous ones, and indeed over the last 5 years, 34 serious accidents have occurred at that roundabout, many of which has involved hospitalisations. And our commitment, Mr Speaker, is to completely transform that intersection, to fix it up, to make it safer, to make it quicker for people to get across it, and will also make it safer for pedestrians, because there will be dedicated pedestrian crossings across that very large and dangerous intersection as we go. This was mooted a decade ago, Mr Speaker, this particular intersection. We're getting on with it. We are fixing it. It's this government which is actually delivering upon it. And of course, these projects are part of the overall plan to build resilience and a stronger economy by busting congestion in our big cities. At the moment, Mr Speaker, it costs over $1.7 billion in avoidable congestion in Brisbane alone, over $25 billion across the nation. Of course, on top of these 9 smaller-scale projects, we've got 22 other smaller-scale projects across the Brisbane area. We've also got massive city-shaping projects well and truly underway, including the M1, including $300 million for the Brisbane Metro, $200 million for the Ipswich motorway, $800 million for the Gateway motorway, and all of these projects across Brisbane and indeed across our nation are designed to get people home sooner and safer. Mr Speaker, no government in Australian history has put more money into infrastructure than our government has. Just 5 years ago, we had a $50 billion pipeline. It was mooted then as the biggest in Australian history. Now we have a $100 billion infrastructure pipeline, and it's because we have a strong economy, and through this pipeline we make it stronger still. Concluded.
And I call the member for Ballarat.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Prime Minister. Why won't the Prime Minister admit what to this table from his own minister's department shows, that not a single project under the Urban Congestion Fund announced over 18 months ago has actually commenced? Not one. Not one.
Members on my left, the member for Lalor. Member for Lalor, the minister has the call.
Well, can I thank the member for Ballarat for her question? And what I can confirm is that we have 130 projects underway right now, as we speak, supporting thousands of people across the country in work across the country. Now, Mr Speaker, on top of that, we have 280 major projects underway as we speak. And if I can find the list, I could go through them one after another of those projects which are well underway, Mr Speaker.
The minister will resume his seat, or just take a seat for a second. Just the Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Trying to help him out, Mr Speaker.
What's the point
it's
of
on
order?
direct relevance. The question was about the Urban Congestion Fund. There's not a single project underway, not one.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The minister has the call. The member for Greenwood.
Mr
Minister
Speaker,
has the call.
on top of the 130 major projects which we have underway, we've also got 166 smaller-scale urban congestion fund projects which we announced before the election, which we are working in close consultation with state governments to get them going, and the first ones will begin at the end of this year. I just mentioned ones in Brisbane which will begin at the beginning of next year, Mr. Speaker. But she asked me again, what about projects which haven't started? Mr. Speaker, there are 2 projects which haven't started. The one I mentioned last time which hasn't started is the East Westlink. That is one that we do want to get underway, Mr. Speaker. We've got $4 billion on the table to get this started, Mr. Speaker. And the Labor Party constantly says, bring forward projects, get them done. Well, there's a project with $4 billion ready to go, and if only the Leader of the Opposition, the member for Ballarat, would pick up the phone to her state counterparts and just say, let's get the job going. And the other one, which I know is also strongly supported over in Western Australia, is of course the Row 8, Row 9 project. Another project, Mr. Speaker, which we would like to see delivered. They're the ones that aren't being delivered, but our other projects absolutely getting underway, delivering on our agenda, 166 smaller scale projects which we're negotiating with state governments, getting the job done, and they'll begin at the end of this year.
The member for Ballarat seeking to table a document.
Thank you. I seek to table the table from his own department that shows not a single project under the Urban Congestion Fund has started.
I bet we're not allowing.
Leave is not granted. The member for Hughes.
Sick of hearing about it. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry. Will the minister outline to the House how the Morrison government's record investment in defence industry is backing small business and creating jobs throughout Australia?
The Minister for Defence Industry. The Minister has the
Thank
call.
you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to thank the member for Hughes for his question because, like me, I'm very proud of our government's commitment to defence industry and to creating more jobs in the defence industry. The Morrison government, Mr. Speaker, is investing $200 billion in our defence capability, creating thousands more jobs in our defence industries and making many, many more opportunities for small businesses. And all of this is possible, Mr. Speaker, because we have a strong economy and because of our government's strong budget management.
Exactly right.
But, Mr. Speaker, this record investment is not just about equipping our defence force, our men and women in uniform, as important as that is. It is also about creating jobs, Australian jobs, good jobs. And it was only last week that the Prime Minister and I had the pleasure of opening QuickStep's new facility out in West Sydney. And let me tell you, Mr. Speaker, manufacturing in Australia is alive and well. And I'm sure the Prime Minister will agree with me that QuickStep is an excellent example of an advanced manufacturing that is actually happening right here in our Australian defence industry. And we have thousands of small businesses in this country that have manufacturing capability that are helping our defence force right across the nation. And QuickStep is no different. It really is a true Aussie success story, Mr. Speaker. In 18 years, it has gone from a small start-up in Western Australia to now being a leading supplier to the global F-35 program. And the new facility that the Prime Minister opened last week will manufacture countermeasures for the F-35 program, which is going to create at least 20 new highly skilled jobs. Now, Mr. Speaker, that's on top of the existing 200 highly skilled jobs that are employed by QuickStep. Mr. Speaker, there is $250,000 worth of QuickStep products on every F-35 globally. And can I tell you, I was incredibly proud when I saw it with my own eyes when I visited Lockheed Martin's production line in Texas the other week. It was a very, very proud moment. And it's businesses like QuickStep, Mr. Speaker, which our government is backing to create more and more Aussie jobs. And all of this is possible, Mr. Speaker, it's worth remembering, because we have a strong economy and we have good budget management. 50 Australian businesses so far, Mr. Speaker, have participated in the F-35 program, manufacturing parts valued at around $1.69 billion and employing more than 2,000 Aussies. We're on track by 2023 to increase that number to 5,000 Australians involved in the F-35 program, sharing in more than $5 billion of work. The Morrison government is backing small businesses and backing those small businesses in our defence industries.
The member for Rankin.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why won't the Prime Minister be straight with the Australian people about the slowest economic growth in a decade, the fact that the OECD has slashed Australia's growth outlook by twice as much as the G20 average, declining productivity, and the fact that net debt has more than doubled on his watch?
The Deputy Prime Minister will cease interjecting. The Prime Minister has the call.
Australia's economic growth is the second highest compared to all the G7 nations of the world, Mr Speaker. 1.4 million jobs have been created, Mr Speaker, under the stewardship of this government. In fact, today there are more people who are employed as a share of Australia's total population than at any other time in Australia's history. Now, only the Labor Party could find a problem with that, Mr Speaker. And that's why we took the strong economic plan we did to the election. And it was a complete contrast to the plan that was taken by those opposite. What we took was a plan to lower taxes, to ensure that we're cutting the costs of doing business in this country, that we're investing in the skills needs of the future of this country, that we're expanding the horizons of our economy by both supporting our traditional industries and developing new export markets, and that we're investing in the infrastructure that Australia needs to grow. That's what we're doing. That's what we took to the Australian people. Now, those opposite took a very different plan. Those opposite took a plan which was going to impose $387 billion of higher taxes on the Australian economy. How they thought that that was going to actually support Australia's growth into the future was a mystery to Australians, and they rightfully rejected those policies at the ballot box. And so there is a clear alternative. There is a clear choice, as we have continued to demonstrate, and that is the sound, stable and certain policies, not getting riled up, not getting spooked by the international conditions that we're faced with, but ensuring we protect the budget resilience that enables us to meet the challenges ahead. The Shadow Treasurer would have us blow the budget on reckless spending. The Shadow Treasurer would have us blow the budget of individual Australians and their families by putting up their taxes. The Shadow Treasurer, who knows what his position is on the climate reduction targets? There's a climate fight club going over on the other side, Mr Speaker, but the thing they've forgotten about climate fight club is you're not supposed to talk about it. But they can't help themselves talking about it, Mr Speaker. We've got the 428 position over here from the member for Hunter. We've got the, well, I'm not 428, but I'm not sure if I'm 445% from the climate change spokesperson. We've got the member for Sydney who's for the 45%, and now we've got the Leader of the Opposition who wants to come into this place and effectively engage in a protest and glue his hands to the dispatch box, Mr Speaker, with his latest outline today, which I note would see the full banning of coal mining in Australia.
Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
I was going to bring out the on weirdness one, Mr Speaker, because that is just not relevant at all to the question.
The Prime Minister has concluded his answer. The member for Longman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Water Resources, Drought, Rural Finance, Natural Disaster and Emergency Management. Will the Minister inform the House how the Morrison government is continuing to create opportunities for the agricultural sector by building resilience and effectively managing the economy?
The Minister for Water Resources.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Longman for his question and his interest in agriculture. Let me tell the member that the story of agriculture is a good one. The story of agriculture is just add rain, and when it does rain, our farmers and our communities will rebound. But until then, we need to work with those communities to get them through one of the worst droughts in our nation's history. Tackling drought is like going up a set of stairs. As it escalates, you take another step. And that has been our response as a government, a $7 billion that we put out there to support our farmers and communities. But one of the first things we did was to get unanimous agreement after the drought summit the Prime Minister called, with states to understand the responsibilities, where states look after animal welfare, freight and fodder, and we look after farmer welfare. So our response comes under 3 pillars, and it's been in action for some time, as this drought, even in my own electorate, has been going for some 8 years. The first pillar is about the here and now, giving people the support, the dignity and respect of getting farm household allowance and putting farm household counsellors around them to help them make the decisions with their financial counsellors about their future, their strategic future. Coupling that with interest loans from the Regional Investment Corporation that's saving farmers tens of thousands of dollars, putting money back in their pockets in the here and now. But then it's also around our second pillar, about our communities, because they also hurt, not just farmers, they also hurt economically, and that's why the Community Drought Program put in $1 million into these shires to build lasting infrastructure that allows the 122 shires that we've given $1 million each to procure local materials using local tradies as a stimulus to keep those towns going. But it's also about targeted mental health, to be able to build the resilience in our farmers and in our communities to get through one of the worst droughts in our nation's history. But thirdly, it's about the future, a future we're positive about. And that's why over $500 million a year this government provides in tax incentives to farmers to be prepared for future droughts, through farm management deposits offsets, in terms of infrastructure write-offs to prepare them for future droughts, but also the Future Fund, $100 million dividend every year to equip our farmers with the tools to be able to tackle drought and communities into the future. But thirdly, under the future, on Sunday we announced more infrastructure for water. Finally, we found a state other than Tasmania that will lead with us, that will build the infrastructure, to build the resilience and to build regional economies through water infrastructure that will change the nation. And I welcome the Queensland Government's announcement that they also want to build it. But now it's time for them to put their hand out and grab ours. I plead with them, come with us. Come with us, even on Mole River. You can support New South Wales in supporting Queensland and those communities in Warwick and Stanthorpe. This is a time for leadership from all levels of government. I plead with every level to work with us to build a stronger and better regional Australia.
The member for Hunter.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. When will the Prime Minister admit that his future drought fund hasn't delivered and will never deliver 1 cent directly to desperate farming families?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the question that has just been posed by the member for Hunter once again demonstrates his complete lack of understanding of the policy issues that fund is seeking to address. The drought fund, which he opposed from the day I first announced it at the Drought Summit, which he attended, and we were very pleased for him to attend, Mr Speaker, on the very day he was speaking against it, and he sought to have it frustrated even in this place. The National Drought Fund, which begins at $3.9 million investment and over the course of the decade will grow to $5 billion, and from the 1st of July of next year it will draw down $100 million to invest in water infrastructure resilience projects from the 1st of July of next year. That's what we said the purpose of the Drought Fund was, and it will draw down on that investment from 1st of July of next year as we put the board in place and as we seek their advice. Now, Mr Speaker,
member for Hunter.
The $300 million we expended just last year on infrastructure and farm household allowance projects and support, Mr Speaker.
Member for
he
Hunter.
interjects again, Mr Speaker. I've already explained to him once. The Drought Fund, the future Drought Fund, is not to provide direct financial assistance payments to farmers. It's there to provide direct support for water resilience projects to plan for the future. Now, if the member for Hunter doesn't think it's a good idea to invest in water resilience for the future of Australian agriculture, he should leave the post of spokesperson on agriculture immediately, because he doesn't understand one of the most fundamental elements of agriculture in this country, which is you have to provide water. When there's a drought, it means there's no water, and so therefore you need to provide storage facilities.
Prime Minister, just pause for a second. I was going to say to the member for Hunter, I'm not going to keep mentioning his name, asking him to cease interjecting. Okay, he's asked the question. I'm pretty tolerant. He can listen to the answer. If he wants to make a speech, he can do it sometime later in the day. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. So, if he took the time to actually understand what the Future Drought Fund was for, rather than seek to play petty politics with this, then he might understand that that fund is there to provide for future water resilience. What we're doing on farm household allowance, Mr Speaker, on what we're doing on rural financial counsellors and what we're doing on support for mental health, on what we're doing to do everything from on-farm water infrastructure, whether it's to increase the allowances for silage investments or on-farm water infrastructure projects that the farmers are actually doing themselves, or whether it's the money we're putting into councils to ensure that they're keeping local communities supported throughout the drought, or more than $50 million we've directly put into charitable organisations like the Salvos and Vinnies. This is a comprehensive response, and I would just simply appeal to the member for Hunter to support the government's initiatives which are reaching out to farmers and just stop being such a dill.
The member for Higgins. The member for Higgins will resume her seat. The Manager of Opposition Business. Manager of Opposition Business.
The Prime Minister concluded with an unparliamentary term which should be withdrawn.
Members on my right. Member for Higgins, resume her seat. It's all right. No one else is going to get the call. It'll be okay. Look, I have previously said, I say to the Manager of Opposition Business, I would rather the discourse be a bit better, and I think it has been. Terms like that are, of course, littered through the Hansard, but I'm prepared to say now I don't welcome them, and I mean I could go through the history of it all, but I'm not going to, at this point. And I think, really, in terms of the interchange, it's not helpful. I'd rather those terms weren't used, I've got to say. I'll just say to the Prime Minister, if those terms are used, they will be used by both sides of the House. And if I did, I'm just going to say to members. No, I'm just going to say to members. I'm going to keep a close watch on this. I did very much think about asking the Prime Minister to withdraw. The only reason I didn't is of terms that have been in, not so much in questions recently, but in speeches, in adjournment speeches, in 90-second statements and all the rest of it. I do have to say the term the Prime Minister used was very much at the lower level of some of the other terms that have been used, and no, I'm not going to repeat them. Okay, the member for Higgins. No, you won't. You'll leave under 94 hours. Couldn't be more clear. Members on my right. The member for Higgins. Member for Higgins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is for the Minister for Health. Will the Minister outline to the House how a strong and stable economy enables the Morrison government to invest in medical research, development and manufacturing? And how is this investment helping deliver advancements through Australian businesses such as CSL and Anatomics to benefit their patients?
The Minister for Health.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Higgins, who comes after a distinguished career in paediatrics, and only today she was helping lead in a bipartisan way the parliamentary polio support group. Now, one of the things that she would have seen in her work was the extraordinary success of our paediatric trauma teams. One particular case involves a young man, Connor. Connor had an accident falling off the rocks in the Byron Bay area, and he had a shattered skull. And this boy was lucky in that he had a trauma team that made a brilliant decision to leave the part of his skull uncapped so as to allow the swelling to occur and then the recovery. But then he was also lucky in that he had a paediatric surgeon who was able to incorporate the latest technology. It's new 3D printed polymer technology, so precision implants that was placed on his skull. It has melded with the sinew and the bone, and he's making a remarkable recovery. That technology came from the Australian firm Anatomics. I was privileged to visit Anatomic's new 3D polymer printing centre in Bentley last week. It comes about as a result of the Medical Research Future Fund $5 billion allocation which we made in the budget this year, and in particular a $900,000 grant under the Biomedtech Horizons program. It will double the number of jobs that this firm has from 40 to 80. But most importantly, it will lead to better treatments for patients here in Australia and abroad. That same pattern we are seeing with the extraordinary investment of CSL, one of Australia's great firms. Their blood fractionation plant in Broadmeadows is currently undergoing a dramatic transformation. $200 million is going into the construction of an extraordinary new blood fractionation facility. This will lead to over 350 jobs at the height of the construction, 230 for construction workers alone, 80 for the project management team and project engineers, and ongoing jobs and a massive increase in their capacity to produce these products. These products include support for patients with haemophilia, support for patients with immune deficiency, and significantly, it comes about and is only possible because the government has a strong economic and budget position which has allowed a long-term agreement of $3.3 billion for supply of blood products in Australia. The combination of the economy, the long-term certainty, the investment has led not only to job creation but, above all else, action which will help save lives and protect lives.
The member for Blair.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why does the Prime Minister claim the government has a drought policy when the National Farmers Federation President, Fiona Simpson, says it doesn't?
The Prime Minister has the call. Deputy Prime Minister. The Deputy Prime Minister will cease interjecting. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for his question because it gives me a good opportunity to point out exactly what the National Farmers Federation has presented to me on these issues. Mr Speaker, the National Farmers Federation has been extremely supportive of the government's response to the drought. They said as much, and directly last night at the 40th anniversary of the National Farmers Federation. I'm not sure whether the member was in attendance on that night, and I thank those members from around the chamber, including from the opposite side, who were in attendance at that event. But those who were there would know that the National Farmers Federation and the President, Fiona Simpson, was very clear, very clear about the appreciation they had for the extensive and comprehensive response that has been provided to the drought by the government in concert, of course, with the state and territory governments where they are affected. Now, the point that the National Farmers Federation has been making about the issue that they have raised is about an agreement that they would like to see between all the states and territories with the Commonwealth, with common standards and common triggers for the activation of state-based drought response. That is what they are seeking, and that is currently what is not in place. Now, after the Drought Summit last year, what we put in place was a reformed national agreement on drought, which added to the original agreement that made it very clear that states and territories were responsible for the initiatives that went directly to the welfare of animals in the farm, and that's the fodder and that's the support for the animals themselves, and that the Commonwealth Government was responsible for the direct assistance, financial assistance, income support and like measures for the farmers and graziers as well. Now, that's what the agreement was reached at the end of last year. What they would like to see is a common set of standards and a common set of triggers and policies by state governments. Now, Mr Speaker, there has not been the response from the state and territory governments to move to that level of standardisation on their drought responses. They believe that they would like to keep complete autonomy about how they customise their response to the droughts in their jurisdictions. And that's a matter for the states and territories. They are sovereign governments and they have constitutional authority for these matters, and that's what they would like to see. I understand why, the National Farmers Federation would like to see greater consistency across these areas, and that is a matter that I've undertaken to work with the National Farmers Federation to see what such a common standard might look like. But at the end of the day, that we have to respect the autonomy and the sovereignty of each of the state governments to deal with these issues that they present. So I thank the member for his question and the opportunity to make this crystal clear. Thank you.
The member for Herbert has the call.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the minister update the House on the importance of the Morrison government's strong and consistent border protection measures? Is the minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question and acknowledge the service to his country and now, of course, to the people in his electorate. He's a very hard-working local member, and we know that in Townsville, like across the rest of the country, people want to make sure that we have control of our borders, and that has not always been the case, of course, Mr Speaker. We know that not so many years ago, the Labor Party, when in power, had 50,000 people arriving on 800 boats, Mr Speaker, and tragically 1,200 people drowned at sea. Now, Mr Speaker, in addition to that, we know that the bill now, racked up as a result of Labor's complete and utter destruction of our border protection policies in this country, has gone up to $16 billion. So 1,200 people drowned at sea, a humanitarian disaster, $16 billion a cost to the budget, money that we could be spending on hospitals, on education, on roads, whatever the Commonwealth funds otherwise. In addition to that, they put people on Manus and Nauru in record numbers and 8,000 children in detention, Mr Speaker. Now, we have sought to clean all of that mess up, and I can inform the House today that we have got in a very good position because of the deal that we did with the United States. So we've got over 630 people off to the United States. But importantly, Mr Speaker, and this is a very important point, we've got the number of people that Labor put on Manus Island down to 4. And we will get that to 0 within coming weeks because the last 4 will transfer to Port Moresby. We've completely closed down the regional processing centre on Manus Island, and we have done that because we don't have new boat arrivals. Now, I'm asked about what the alternative policy would be, and you would have thought, given that Labor presided over a system of 8,000 children into detention, all of those people drowning, all of the detention centres that they had to open to cope with the complete disaster that they presided over, you would have thought they wouldn't repeat those mistakes again. But, Mr Speaker, they are. You see, the Shadow Minister is presiding over a policy disaster again. She has no idea what she's doing in relation to Medivac laws, in relation to border protection laws, in relation to national security laws, all watered down on her watch. And, Mr Speaker, the Labor Party continue to eat themselves alive, not just in relation to climate change policy, not just in relation to economic policy, but in relation to border protection policy as well, Mr Speaker. And all of this is happening on the watch of the Leader of the Opposition, who has been the chief cheerleader. The Leader of the Opposition is the chief cheerleader, Mr Speaker, of weak border protection policy. He stood up at conference after conference and sought to water down Labor's border protection policy. He has learnt nothing in his years in this place, and Labor can never be trusted on border protection.
No, I haven't called you. There's too many people interjecting behind you. The member for Kingston.
Oh, thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Why won't the Prime Minister admit childcare fees have increased by 30% under his 3-term government?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I'll invite the Minister for Education to add to this answer. But, Mr Speaker, on this matter, as Minister for Social Services, which had responsibility for childcare at the time, it was actually our government that introduced the reform package to childcare, which those opposite when they were in government and those opposite when they were opposition failed to deliver. And that is ensuring that people, particularly on low and middle incomes, are getting access to up to 85% rebates. 85% rebates under our government, and we got rid of the caps that were applied to those seeking childcare rebates that had previously seen them run out of childcare support by about February and March of every year. So we took action to address the manifold failures that were in the childcare system that turned into a money pit from what was designed under those opposite when they were in government. And I invite the Minister for Education to add further to this answer.
The Minister for Education, representing the Minister.
Well, thanks, Mr Speaker, and thanks, Prime Minister, because you've pretty much covered it all. The most comprehensive reforms ever undertaken in our history, and which will see $10 billion going into childcare. $10 billion. And what has this meant? Out-of-pocket expenses have dropped by 7.9%. 7.9% out-of-pocket expenses for Australian parents. And we are going to make sure that we keep on delivering affordable childcare of high quality for Australian parents, because those opposite were not doing that. You failed to do that. It was only through the reforms led by the Prime Minister that we've got the outcomes that we're seeing in childcare. And, Prime Minister, I commend you for what you did, because you have put this sector on the right path.
The member for North Sydney.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reductions. As we mark the 70th anniversary of the Snowy Hydro scheme this week, will the Minister update the House on how the Morrison government is delivering lower energy prices for consumers right across the country? And is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction.
Well, I thank the honourable member for his question, and I acknowledge his strong commitment to affordable, reliable energy for all Australians while we reach our emission reduction obligations and while we keep a strong economy, Mr Speaker. And he is right. This week does mark the 70th anniversary of the Snowy Hydro scheme, and it's a great time to reflect on that iconic engineering feat and its long history in serving our nation. And indeed, this week, Mr Speaker, we are also celebrating the 75th anniversary of the Liberal Party. And it's important to note that the Snowy scheme is just another incredible achievement of Liberal governments, Mr Speaker, of Liberal governments. Now, I have a close personal connection to the Snowy scheme. I have a close personal connection to the scheme. The Minister will resume
his seat for a second. The Leader of the Opposition on a point
Mr Speaker, Ben Chifley was no Tory. And you opposed it, your lot.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Minister has the call.
I was saying, Mr Speaker, I have a deep personal connection to the scheme. My grandfather, William Hudson, worked on the scheme as the Chief Engineer and Commissioner throughout the construction, and I acknowledge that many others in this House have close personal connections to the scheme, including the member for Sydney.
Could the Leader of the Opposition cease interjecting?
The
Minister pause for a second. I just think it would be better if the Minister just stuck to the question and dealt with the question he's been asked, and let's leave all the personal relationships out of it for the time being, I think.
No, Mr Speaker. Demand, the scheme powers more than 500,000 houses. 500,000 houses across the east coast of Australia, Mr Speaker. And it's also this government that has committed to the Snowy 2.0 project, which will help to reduce the volatility of electricity prices and to reduce the average price of power, Mr Speaker, as it takes advantage of the low prices during the day and brings down prices at those peak times, particularly in January and in the evening when the sun goes down, Mr Speaker. Now, this combined with other policies, including the default market offer and the retailer reliability obligation, is helping to bring power prices down and put power back into the hands of consumers, Mr Speaker. Now, I welcome reports this week that the opposition will now support the government's big stick legislation.
big stick legislation to back consumers against the unacceptable and unsustainable practices that the ACCC has highlighted. But, Mr Speaker, on this side, we know that for 75 years it's been the Liberal Party that has supported lower, more affordable power prices, and whilst Labor governments, Mr Speaker, and the opposition has supported reckless targets and carbon taxes. Indeed, Mr Speaker, we've seen them in open hostility in recent days over their energy and carbon policies, Mr Speaker. Only this side of the House has a plan to deliver affordable, reliable power, meeting our emission obligations and keeping a strong economy.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.